So we're going to continue where we left off in the last lesson. And this time we're going to create our user detail page. So I'm going to start by creating the component. So page user detail. You can name it however you like. I just like to be consistent with the naming. So it is a page that we're going to have a URL for it. And that belongs to a user. And that's what it's doing. Now, let's create a router now on the app. I'm just going to copy this user. And here we want to pass the ID. And to do that, you do a colon and pass the parameter name that you want. It could be anything like name or username. We're going to use the ID. And here is the user detail, the name of the component. Now, if you load our server, npm start, now we get our user detail. If you go back to our user list, and we can navigate to that URL. So now let's create a function that is going to retrieve the data with this ID, or whichever ID appears in here. So user service, here we're going to create another function called getUser, and this will accept that UID from the router, and we're going to use that to retrieve the data. So here we're going to use yet another rxfire method, which is called docData, and we're going to return it. So return docData. Now this one takes a document reference and an ID. So here we're going to call Firestore again, and now it's not a collection, it's a doc, and we can pass the collection with the UID all together, just like that. If you hover it, we're having the same problem, that is returning observable of an object. So let's just tell them that is we want a user. That's what we were retrieving. So if you hover over it again, it's observable of user. So I'm just going to paste in here so we can see what our functions are doing. Now let's do the same as we did here on the top and tap the data again. It's gonna change this one here for get users and get user, so we know which one is which. Now back in our component, the user detail, we're gonna add some information on the template. I'm first gonna add the navbar, so we have access to the sidebar. Navbar. And here the title would be user detail or whatever you want. Now don't forget the comma. Let's do an ion content. Here I'm just gonna do a h1 with the username. This.user.displayName. And also I'm gonna display something else. So this.user.uid. Now we need to grab this internal state. So add state from Stencil core, import it. So user, it's a user, and it's from our interface, not from Firebase. So now because we are using the Ionic router, they do not have any method to retrieve the URL. So we're gonna have to use the location API to do that. So here we're gonna use the component will load, so we can get the data before anything is rendered. So I'm gonna create a variable to hold the UID of the user. So let's get a location. And here ref, href is going to return the URL. Now let's just console log this UID and see what we're getting. Because here we're going to have to split and then get one entry of the array. Now if you reload, this is the URL. Just ignore this arrow, that's because we don't have any data yet. So this is the URL, and now we need to split it and get this last information here. So back on the component, I'm just gonna comment it out so we don't get the error. So here if you do a split, and split, it will always return you an array, and we want to split on the slash so we can get the information after this slash over here, so between user and thing. Now if you reload, we get this an array with 5 items, and the entry number 4 is the one we want with the ID. Here we can just say entry 4 or index 4, and there we go, we get the UID. Now we can pass this information to our getUser function. So user service imported and getUser, and here we can pass the UID. Now let's subscribe to it. This dot subscribe, and data will be this dot user equals data. Now if you save this, we can uncomment this. If you see my editor behaving weird like this, it's because I use Prettier, this plugin. It auto format my code. Sometimes it's annoying, especially with JSX, but it's really helpful. So let's take a look in the browser. I have our list. If I click, we navigate in there. Now I'm getting the display name is not available, but my data is here. My data arrived after my component was ready. So let's just do some tests over here. So if this dot user, we show that, otherwise it's a null value because we don't have any data to display. We can do the same for the, there we go. Now if I reload, my error is gone and I'm getting my data over here. Same for the other user, but the other user doesn't have a display name yet, so it doesn't show. Now here we are subscribing to this data, and when you subscribe, this will open a channel to the data and keep it open, and if there is any change on the server, it will change the data automatically for you. Now every time you do a subscription and you are here on your component, this component subscribes to the user, and then you move away. Now you don't need that user anymore. But this connection will still be open, so we need to close it. Now, to do that, you need to unsubscribe from your observables. Now, let's create can be a state, user sub, and usually when you're dealing with observable, it's common practice to add a $sign in front, so you know that that is an observable. Here is going to be a type of subscription, and I'm going to import from RxJS. This is just so we can get the typings. It's nothing that important. So on component, we'll unload. This is a life cycle of when you leave the component, you don't need it anymore, it will destroy it. So here we can just do this dot user subscription, unsubscribe. So now we just need to mark it this dot user sub equals this. This is a subscription. We are storing it in this user sub, and whenever the component will not be used anymore, it will unload and unsubscribe to our data. Like this, you won't have memory leaks on your application. This is really important. Now we need to do this for our other component as well. On the user list. So here I'm going to do component will unload, add another state, users sub type of subscription. So this dot user sub equals, and here we can this.usersub and unsubscribe. Alright, this is usually the common workflow for subscriptions. You subscribe and then you unsubscribe when you don't need it anymore. Now let's do something about our user detail page, which is quite ugly at the moment. Back here in our user page, I'm going to start with the template, and I'm going to remove this nav bar because I'm going to add some buttons that is particular for this component. So here I'm going to add an Ion header and some buttons. So just to follow the suit without the border on toolbar, and here I'm gonna add an Ion back button. This comes from Ionic, but it's really unreliable, so I'm just gonna mark it in here and I will show you after what I mean. Now this is the start. Just gonna copy this one, add an Ion title, and here's the end. Now is the menu button here. Okay, for the title I'm gonna add a check. If there is a user, we add the username. If not, we add just write a profile as a string. So if this user has a display name, we show it, otherwise we show profile. Okay, so now let's tackle the content. Here I'm going to create an Ion grid so we can center the user inside. So Ion grid, Ion row, and Ion call. So now here, instead of doing all this check, I'm going to do only one, but for the whole block, so we don't need to do on each property. So just before the Ion call, I'm going to check if there is a user. And if there is a user, I'm going to show the column, otherwise undefined. And here in the call, we can put the user, and we don't need to do the check anymore. Okay, so instead of doing the check for each of these, we do only once, but for the whole block. That's can save time and make our code a bit more readable. So now let's just add some CSS to center this in the middle of the page. Just before, let's add a user thumbnail as well. So the thumbnail is gonna show image, the user avatar. Okay, now let's go into the CSS. It's gonna paste in here. We did this before. We're giving the Ion grid 100%, so it takes all the space. We're aligning the items vertically and horizontally. But here, instead of taking up all the space, I'm doing 80%, so it stays a little bit on top. Now this is just to display the thumbnail with this size. The margin auto is gonna center it. Here I'm giving some space between the name and the photo URL, and make it a round shape. So I have my server running, but we got an error here. I need to remove that nav bar that we don't need anymore. So now that is looking a little bit better, let's just add an icon here to take them to the user update page, but only show it if the user is the owner. So let's get back to our code. And I'm gonna create a function that will check for that user ownership. So it's gonna be async because we need to wait for some data. And here we need to get a UID, which we're going to use this one here. So we can pass it in here, this.check ownership UID. Now let's create a state that will hold that is admin information. So is owner, a boolean, and here we can set the default value for it as well, just like that. Let's create a button just before the IO menu icon, and here we can say this.isOwner. If it's true, we show the button. If not, undefined. So ion button, and here I'm gonna put an icon. The icons doesn't have an edit icon, so the closest one they have is the create, which looks like a pen. And here we can send them to the user update. So let's create this route. If you go to the app.tsx, and we're doing it inside the tab so we can have access to it from within the user dashboard after as well. So let's just copy this one, and here we can call the page user update. And we can leave the prop as well because we're going to need it. And here we need to pass the URL. So URL equals update. Now the route that we gave it over here is home user update. Here we have a home route that takes all of these other routes inside. Home user update. User is children of home, update is children of user. So now we can go back and hook up this function in here. We're gonna use the authentication service to grab the current user. So user equals auth service using the auto import. Got import in here. And we also need to import first operator from RxJS. The first operator will give us the first data that the observable emits, and we're going to use that. So here we can use app_service.user, and then we're gonna pipe it and use that first. So whenever this observable emits some data, we're gonna grab that the data, whatever comes first, and here we're gonna make it a promise so we can await for this data to come back. That would be the same as putting a then over here as in a normal promise. We're waiting and we're storing it in the user variable. Now we can just do the check. If the UID, which comes from the URL from here, equals this user ID, then he's the owner. So we can mark this is owner equals true. And that's all about our check. Now let's go back to our page and check. My server is running. So now if I reload, I'm going to start my server again. Now back in our page, I have my icon there. And if I click, it takes me to this empty page because we don't have the component or anything on that route. So now let's go back to the user list, and if I go to this user, which I'm not the owner, I don't have the button. So our check works and we can navigate. So now I was saying about the Ion back button to be unreliable, and the reason is, for example, if you are here on the list, I'm gonna refresh and I'll go there, I'll have my button here. But then if I refresh in here, my button disappears, and even if I go back in there, I don't have it anymore. And that's because when you refresh, you lose your browser history, and this Ion button will only show if there is a browser history. A way to fix that is to create your own button, which can easily be done by just adding your own button here, and I think the name is arrow back. So I'm gonna comment it out, this Ion button. Now if I reload, I have that button in there. Looks a bit different, but that's one way that you can make sure that the back button will always be there. But that's up to you. I'll leave it in here. Now our user profile is looking much better. We have our link in here, and let's create our update page then.